May 2, 1945, Berlin wedding. In a narrow notebook dented by shrapnel, a German civilian named Karl H. wrote a line he could not have spoken aloud. "We will rebuild on ruins and on silence because the truth would starve us." He closed the notebook. He looked at the street. It was a canyon of brick and absence. The war had ended for him not at a front, but in a courtyard where windows were eyes filled with ash. A woman dragged a door across the pavement for fuel. A child held a kettle and stared at a shattered mirror as if it were a lake. Men counted sacks of cement that did not exist. The arithmetic of daily life had shifted from wages to calories, from citizenship to permission slips. The Soviet armored columns had entered the city days earlier. Allied flags would fly, but this sector would be red, and would be red for years. The Red Army nurse had followed the guns. She lived in a requisition school a kilometer from Karl's apartment. She wrote in her own journal, "Berlin is not a city, it is a diagnosis." Her name in the oral histories is Lydia Mikhailovna, age 23, from near Smolensk, trained in a field hospital that had marched across white and black maps since 1942. She is the one who will accompany the story from bandages and amputations to the conversations that never happen in kitchens at night. The front had been loud. The after was quiet. The after smelled of damp plaster and sour smoke. May 8, 1945, an improvised clinic in a school on Fenstrasse. It was Victory Day for some, and a day of reckoning for others. By dawn, the nurses boiled instruments in enamel pots. They cut strips from tablecloths. They passed camp mugs along a line of men who were not yet soldiers, not yet prisoners, and not yet anything except hungry. A Soviet medical unit list survives in the Bundesarchiv on microfilm, stamped captured enemy records, 17 German civilians treated for shrapnel wounds, 1 newborn delivered, 2 septic fevers, 1 old man dead of exhaustion. A woman in a blue coat arrived at the school with her boy. She had 3 words left that had not been used up in the battle. Husten, Blut, Hilfe. Cough, blood, Hilfe. Cough, blood, help. The doctor gestured to Lydia. The boy was feverish and rattled. Coal dust lined his breath. Lydia had been told to keep her pity for the wounded of the Red Army. But pity is a habit like any other. She held the boy's shoulders. She listened to the watery lungs. She gave him sulfonamide tablets, stamped with American letters that had reached the Soviet kit through Lend-Lease and barter and luck. She heard German behind her, one phrase repeated, "We didn't know." It was a sentence that would travel through kitchens and files for decades. It was not always a lie. It was not always true. The mathematics of not knowing would be an exact science in 1945, though its numbers were written on fogged glass. Occupation began with orders. Curfew. Prohibitions. Shaving off swastikas from walls and from wrists. Karl watched Soviet officers post notices in Russian and clumsy German on bullet-scarred doors. Surrender of weapons. Curfew from 22 to 5,000. No assemblies, report addresses. In Karlshorst, the Soviet command installed itself in a villa, and the city was measured into zones with chalk and with guns. A British occupation report dated June 2, 1945 noted, "Overall mood of civilian population, exhausted, inclined towards compliance, fearful of retribution." Allied intelligence summaries in the western sectors included a sentence of social mathematics. A strict curfew introduces a predictable schedule into a landscape otherwise governed by scarcity and rumor. The mathematics of missing persons was always off by at least one. Karl's wife had been sent to relatives in Teltow with their daughter in January. The trains were chaotic. The post was a memory. The numbers that mattered were tiny, 1, 2, 3. By mid-May, he found no note at the apartment, no chalk mark on the door that the neighbors sometimes used to signal survival. He visited a municipal list pasted to a hospital wall. There were 278 names typed with a weak ribbon. A clerk had added 5 more by hand. None of them were his. He had a job before the war, in an office that measured insurance premiums and the value of broken teeth. He had a party badge he had never worn on his lapel. He had joined out of fear, ambition, habit, and the arithmetic of "it's easier that way." He had told himself he was not a political man. The rubble was everywhere. It was material and metaphor and employment. The Trümmerfrauen, women of all ages with scarf-wrapped heads and gloves cut from boots, formed lines 2 bodies wide, 3 bodies deep. They filled handcarts. They scraped mortar off bricks. They passed them hand to hand. The mathematics of the brick line was pure. If each woman passed 6 bricks per minute, if the day had 8 hours, if the street had 100,000 bricks, how many days to expose the cobblestones again? Karl watched. He carried some bricks himself. He recorded nothing on paper. He tried to imagine a future tense. Summer 1945. The Allies planned denazification. They planned it in broad rooms with polished tables and in cramped offices with stacked forms. They planned it in 4 languages and with uneven zeal. Denazification was an idea and a file cabinet. The American military government, OMGUS, printed millions of questionnaires, the Fragebogen, questions about membership, questions about ranks in the party and affiliated organizations, questions about what the last 12 years were about. Spruchkammern, special chambers staffed with Germans under Allied oversight, would assign categories: major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, exonerated. The mathematics of guilt was operationalized in checkboxes and stamps. Karl received his questionnaire in July. He read it at a table that had lost 1 leg and leaned against the wall for support. He paused at the line for NSDAP membership, yes/no. He had joined in 1937 after his boss suggested it would improve his prospects. He paid dues, he attended 3 meetings, he signed a petition to collect winter relief. He did not hit anyone, and he did not save anyone. He wrote, "No political activity, office work only." He left the line for party function blank. He found a neighbor who had been a social democrat before 1933, who now offered a Persilschein, a whitewash paper, attesting to his decency. The document lives in a denazification file in the Landesarchiv, with a coffee stain touching the signature like a watermark of honesty or its impersonation. August 1945. The Red Army settled into its role as an occupying force that had to feed itself and police a hostile city that was also a wounded city. The NKVD established special camps north and east. Sachsenhausen reopened as Special Camp No. 7. Buchenwald became Special Camp No. 2. The Soviet nurse learned new routines. She still dressed wounds, but she also translated silence into actions, who was allowed into the clinic, who was refused, who would be passed across a threshold that led to a city office, and who would be passed into a truck. Her oral history, recorded in the 1990s in Ver, says, "I did not ask questions I could not bear to know the answers to. We had been taught the Germans were wolves. Then they were children with lice. Then they were both." A woman in a notebook in Charlottenburg wrote, "They are taking men away. Who? Why? Who were they before? Who will they be after?" The answer varied by street. A former party block warden, a rival for a room, a man who had worn the wrong uniform at the wrong hour. The mathematics of guilt did not always add up. Occupation reports filed by the American Office of Military Government in neighboring sectors noted German complaints about arbitrary arrests in the Soviet zone. Soviet communiques listed reasons in thick nouns: sabotage, counter-revolution, hostile agitation. The truth was fractal. There were guilty men. There were men guilty of nothing but being misnamed at dusk. The city tried to feed itself. It failed most days. The hunger winter of 1945–46 was not mathematics, it was anatomy. Bones and blue fingers, ration cards distributed like amulets. The official ration in Berlin fell to 1,000 calories per day for normal consumers. Heavy laborers were supposed to receive 3,000. Children were supposed to be protected. They were not. The black market began to solve problems the state could not. Cigarettes emerged as a currency because they were portable, divisible, and desired. Karl traded his pocket watch, a gift from a father who had believed in empires, for a sack of potatoes. He traded a family photograph for 6 cigarettes. He did not smoke. He placed the cigarettes on the table and resented how useful they were. The arithmetic of survival: 1 cigarette equals 1 kilo of beets. 5 cigarettes equals a pair of shoes with a cracked sole. Starvation expressed itself in equations. The Soviet nurse watched German and Soviet hunger side by side. Soviet rations were only marginally better. Soviet soldiers gave away bread one day and took a bicycle the next. She wrote, "We were told to be victorious. No one told us how to be fair." In a ward on Putlitzstrasse, she treated a Red Army corporal with a shrapnel-torn thigh. She treated a German woman with a miscarriage. She treated a Polish forced laborer who had refused to leave Berlin until he found the grave of a friend. On a shelf near the window stood a stack of captured German medical primers, overwritten with Russian initials. In the corner was a crate stenciled, UNRWA. In it were tins of milk and sacks of rice from across an ocean that would soon turn cold. Autumn 1945. The machinery of denazification made an industrial sound. The Sprüchkammern took testimony, took oaths, took bribes. Variants of the same sentence repeated: I only followed orders. I was only a follower. I was only there once. I saw nothing. The documents record patterns. In Württemberg-Baden by December 1946, 2.1% were labeled offenders, 6.6% were lesser offenders, 35.5% followers, 49.3% exonerated. The percentage varied by sector and by the seat. American zeal rose and fell with political winds. British pragmatism bent like willow. The French pursued their own policies with severity in pockets and neglect in others. In the Soviet zone, denazification often meant removal of nomenclature with replacement by new nomenclature. Some were purged for their past. Some were purged for their past. Some were purged because there were new pasts being written. The mathematics of guilt could be used to build a party. Karl's hearing was called in March 1946. He wore a jacket too thin for the weather. He brought his Purcell Shane. He listened as a former colleague testified that he had stamped forms and not people. He listened as the panel asked if he had ever denounced anyone. He said no. He had once complained about a co-worker who arrived late. The co-worker had then disappeared into another department. He did not know if the two facts were connected. He did not know. He was classified Mitläufer, a follower. He was told he could return to work, though not to management. He nodded with relief. He felt shame and felt relieved to feel it. He found a job in a municipal ration office in Wedding in June. He would measure hunger with a pencil. The office had a map with pins: blue for distribution points, red for thefts, black for raids. Karl's task was to read the names printed on ration cards and cross-check them against the lists of the living. The list of the living and the list of the dead were not reconciled. The numbers did not converge. The arithmetic of death resisted bureaucratic order. He learned to recognize forged cards by the small errors in ink. He learned to distinguish hunger from theft. A child who steals bread is both. He wrote one line in his notebook: "When I stamp the card, I stamp a life. I do not want this power. I do not want this power. I do not want to refuse it." Winter 1946-47 grew colder and harder. The bridges creaked. The pipes froze. The hunger winter acquired a capital letter. Electricity flickered off in homes where walls could not hold it in. In the ration office, a woman fainted standing up. In the Soviet clinic, the nurse's breath made clouds. She warmed her hands under a lamp. She wrote, "Sometimes we stole firewood. Sometimes we stole minutes from sleep. Sometimes we stole a smile from someone and saved it for later." The nurses knew tragedies by the sound, the cough that had gone too far, the silence of a room where there had once been argument. Displaced persons lived in camps not far from tram lines and from kitchens that had once held pictures of German soldiers smiling in Feldgrau. Jewish survivors in the British zone near Hamburg gathered in huts at Bergen-Belsen, where they painted the earth with names. Survivors in the American zone near Munich in Feldafing, Landsberg, Fehrenwald, waited for visas and for justice, and for an apology they knew would not be worth its weight. In the Soviet zone, DP camps were fewer. The Jewish survivors avoided them if they could. The German civilians walked past barbed wire and past signs written in Yiddish and Polish and Ukrainian, and saw faces on the other side that carried a thinness that was not only hunger. Karl visited his cousin in the American sector and saw a camp at Schlachtensee. He watched a line outside a distribution hut where men spoke Hebrew, a language he had rarely heard on his street. A survivor's testimony recorded by an American chaplain reads, "A German man stared at our line as if we were ghosts." Perhaps we were. Contact with victims was intermittent and avoided. It happened in markets, on trains, in property disputes. The fleeing Jewish woman who knocked on a door to say, "This was my house." The forced laborer who walked near a family garden and asked for bread. The German farmer had taken in an Ostarbeiter out of need in 1942 and watched him go in 1945 and wondered if the man would return with a gun in 1946. Denial was a posture and a domestic strategy. Allied intelligence summaries from the fall of 1945 catalogued German responses to reports of camps: incredulity, minimization, defensive suffering. One American propaganda officer, a teacher in peacetime, wrote, "We show them newsreels. They discuss technicalities. They ask for milk powder." The Soviet nurse entered a building near Siemensdamm. She had been told to triage. On the floor, arranged like question marks, were 4 men in striped cloth. They were not German. They were returned forced laborers who had escaped to train in April. They had not yet left Berlin because there was nowhere to go to. A Dutch man with cheekbones like the edges of a blade asked for water in a language she did not know. She brought water anyway. He drank and spilled. She wrote later, "I learned to hear what I did not understand. I learned the mathematics of thirst. 1 cup equals an hour of life. It is easy to draw maps. It is hard to draw hunger." But maps would come anyway. May 1947. The Marshall Plan was proposed by a general with a calm face and a blunt style, and by economists who could do math in multiple currencies. American ships carried sacks of wheat and drums of oil across the Atlantic. The mathematics of aid was debated in ministries and in kitchens. Would it come? To whom? With what strings? The Soviet zone would be outside the plan. The divide that bombing had begun and ideology had widened would become architecture. But for Karl, before the Cold War had walls, it was a rumor that traveled on warm bread. There is flour today in Tiergarten. Currency reform in the Western zones came in June 1948. Overnight, old paper became memory. The Reichsmark died. The Deutsche Mark was born. Prices reeled and then straightened. Shop windows filled. Black market arithmetic collapsed, and cigarettes lost their power. In the east, the Ostmark followed. The city split along numbers. The Soviets launched a blockade in late June to squeeze West Berlin of fuel and food. The airlift began, engineers and propellers, and the mathematics of tonnage and weather. Calorie charts were recalculated on clipboards. Karl stood in the courtyard and watched Dakota planes stitch white threads across the sky. A boy next to him held a hand out to feel the wind of a candy parachute and shouted, "Raisin bombers!" The arithmetic of mercy can be small and sugar-coated or large and measured in thousands of tons per day. During the airlift, the Soviet nurse received new orders. Her unit would be posted at Karlshorst to handle fevers and accidents among dock workers who operated in an economy of coal, grace, resentment, and fear. She had grown older fast. She had been a soldier and a midwife and a witness. In 1949, when two German states were proclaimed, Federal Republic in the West, German Democratic Republic in the East, she looked at her own reflection in a wash basin and said to it, "We are all categories now." She wrote in a letter preserved in a family album in Tver, "Berlin was a city of bandages and lies. Sometimes the bandages and the lies were necessary to keep people alive. Sometimes not." She left Berlin in late 1949 and went east through Poland and into a USSR that offered her a medal and a winter. Karl took a job in 1950 at a factory that made electrical components in Siemensstadt, a name that had survived ideology by turning into current. It was a job that required a timetable and produced things that hummed. The Wirtschaftswunder had not yet acquired its name, but it had acquired a heartbeat. Marshall Plan shipments had delivered steel and oil. The factory floor smelled of rubber and quiet optimism. Men who had worn grey uniforms now wore blue coveralls. Women who had passed bricks now passed parts along lines that made a mechanized sound like a new sort of rain. The mathematics of prosperity was slower than the mathematics of hunger, but more durable. Wages rose. Meat returned to plates. Coal piles grew. School books were printed that taught the case structure of the German language and the necessity of democratic institutions. Some pages mentioned Hitler as a kind of weather that had passed. Some pages mentioned crimes with one column and suffering with three. City councils debated memorials to Trümmerfrauen that did not mention what the rubble was made of. Monuments to the dead were erected with words that did not name who had killed. The arithmetic of memory is not neutral. It is a budget written by those who survived and intend to continue. Bundesarchiv records preserve drafts of speeches that use the term Stunde Null, the 0 hour, a concept that tidy minds loved and messy lives denied. Denazification slid into redintegration. West German politics, under pressure of the Cold War, passed the 131 Gesetz in 1951 to reinstate many civil servants whose careers had been interrupted. The mathematics of state legitimacy demanded functioning administration, and functioning administration demanded experience. That experience often wore a tie that had once held a party pin. In Karl's factory, the personnel department promoted a man named J.J. R., who had been an Ortsgruppenleiter in 1943, to manage procurement. He was industrious and formal and preferred not to talk about the past. His file in the denazification registry read Follower, Category 4. The mathematics of guilt inverted. The guiltier often better connected, the better connected often more necessary, the necessary often rehabilitated. The line between justice and stability is drawn with a ruler and erased with hands. The new democracy did not rest on innocence. It rested on bargains. The first was obvious: prosperity in exchange for forgetting what had enabled the hunger. The second was subtle: witness in exchange for marginality. Those who spoke too often were invited to speak less. Those who kept their files thin were invited to fill their wallets. Karl learned the new customs with the ease of a man who had once learned to fill ration cards. He voted. He watched speeches that contained flour instead of ideology. He swallowed criticisms and drank beer. He told himself that quiet was a civic virtue. He believed it until he didn't. Then he believed it again. East Germany built a different mathematics. The GDR claimed to have rooted out fascism and to be built on anti-fascist foundations. Denazification was used as purge and as legend. Files in the BStU later opened to researchers show that many ex-NS functionaries reinvented themselves as anti-fascists and joined the SED. The mathematics of loyalty was recalculated in dialectical materialism and in human fear. In 1953, workers rose, waving wage slips and hope. Soviet tanks answered. West Berlin watched. Karl crossed through a checkpoint after the smoke diluted and saw the rushed paint covering slogans on walls. He saw the Soviet nurse's old hospital building. He wondered if she was somewhere in Russia stirring soup and forgetting Berlin. He wrote in his notebook, "They tell us who we are by telling us who we were. They are wrong. We are what we tolerate." He visited a school where his daughter, found in 1946 in Teltow and now healthy enough to scold him, learned geography with maps that did not yet show the wall. When the wall went up in 1961, it made permanent certain mathematics of division that had been implied at the airlift. It took brick math and applied it to futures. Police reports in municipal archives list disturbances. A letter from a West Berlin teacher to a colleague in Bremen notes, "The children drew the wall like a river. They will not cross it often, but they will cross it in their heads." Karl's daughter asked him what he had done during the war. He said, "I signed papers." She said, "That is not nothing." He nodded and did not elaborate. In the 1960s, memory grew teeth in courtrooms. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials from 1963 to 1965 aired words that did not fit into early schoolbooks. Witnesses described a mathematics of death factories that had been hidden in euphemism. The judges asked precise questions. The accused answered with fog. West Germany felt a pressure that was not allied. It was internal. The generational arithmetic was simple. Children asked questions their parents did not want to answer because the answers would disturb a prosperity that had finally felt safe. Karl read newspaper accounts and knew that quiet had been both shield and complicity. He wrote, "We are a nation of accountants. It is not an insult. We balance books that include hunger and shame." The Red Army nurse, whose life had become ordinary in Smolensk, read about Germany again in Soviet newspapers that described fascists and capitalist intrigue. The Cold War required categories that reduced complexity to usable shapes. She kept her Berlin notebook in a drawer. In it were entries that were the opposite of propaganda, small and human. Girl picking at scab. Boy with scar calls me auntie. German man gives me a potato with eyes and laughs as if it is a pet. I laugh too. She had delivered a child in a basement while shells fell. She had held hands of men who spoke languages that did not share roots with hers. She had seen a wall erected in a city where the only walls that should have existed were the ones ready to fall for new light. Public commemorations in West Germany in the 1950s and 60s leaned towards synthesis and away from dissection. Bombing was commemorated with white roses placed in ruins. Expulsions from the East, which involved 12 to 14 million German speakers and at least 500,000 of their dead, were commemorated with stone that said, "We will not forget our homeland." The stones did not say what had prompted the whirlwind. The arithmetic of suffering did not include a ledger for cause and effect. Denazification files were not read at parades. School books in the 1950s contained clean lines that avoided the mud of the camps. This was not only malice, it was a function of a political and psychological transition that could not handle the full current of history without tripping the circuit. Bureaucrats chose circuits that held. Displaced persons moved on. Many went to Israel and to the United States. Some stayed, married, made new circles. Former forced laborers returned to places where their arrival was not celebrated. The mathematics of compensation crept into parliaments and ministries. Who could claim? What evidence? What category? Courts demanded documents that war had burned. As late as the 1990s, German compensation schemes would write last checks to slave laborers whose hands shook as they signed. The arithmetic of justice is slow and loses numbers along the way. There is no rounding up, only down. The expellees from Silesia, Pomerania, East Prussia had arrived in the late 1940s with suitcases made of wood and hands that still knew how to milk cows and clean guns. They arrived in cities that did not want them and towns that could not feed them. The mathematics of housing, a two-room flat with 6 people becomes a two-room flat with 9. A proverb emerges, willkommen, aber nicht zu Haus. Welcome, but not at home. A family from Breslau moved into a front room of a Hamburg widow and hung a crucifix over a spot where her husband's picture had been. Arguments about coal allocations contained whole histories. Local councils kept lists of wild settlements established on the edges of bombed-out streets. A municipal memo from Kiel reads, "Integration requires roofs and stories. We can provide the first. The second will take longer." In East Germany, the state forced memory with a hammer that left dents. Anti-fascist rituals replaced conversations. The mathematics of fear balanced missing fathers against new slogans. The Stasi learned its own arithmetic of surveillance. How many informants per block, per factory, per school? People learned to say nothing in kitchens at night, or they learned to whisper into pillows. The line between public and private lives was not only ideological, it was bodily. Karl visited relatives in Leipzig in 1965 and noticed they laughed less and drank more. He wrote, "Their laughter has a geometry, straight lines and short arcs." He tried to tell them he had also learned silence. They smiled without claiming it. Documents replaced dialogue. Occupation reports became annual reports. Denazification files became career ladders, then refused ladders, then footnotes in dissertations. Allied intelligence summaries morphed into television documentaries. Oral histories began to be recorded in the 1970s and 1980s with microphones that could capture size. Listening to an old man named G, recorded in a Bremen kitchen in 1978, one hears him say, "I was not guilty." He pauses. "But I was not innocent." The recording captures a spoon tapping a glass. The mathematics of that moment includes time since the war, number of funerals attended, number of photographs turned face down in family albums. Karl's factory pension came in 1979. He retired with a watch that was new and a collection of ration cards that were old. He put both in a drawer. He had learned to curate his own past. He taught his granddaughter how to read a ledger and how to add columns in her head. He did not teach her how to balance shame. That was not so easily passed on. Throughout, the Soviet nurse remained a counterpoint. Her life was the scaffolding that allowed a certain humanity to be built in zones where ideology had overbuilt. In the Bundesarchiv, a researcher in 1998 found a list of medical units that had served in Berlin in 1945. Next to the number of her unit, there is a rubber stamp and a note. Personnel rotated back, October 1949. Oral histories recorded in 1992 in Tver and in Novgorod include two women who remember Berlin similarly. "We learned not to hate," one says. "We learned to count bandages. The mathematics of bandages is never precise but always urgent. Every roll is measured in centimeters and in stories." In the late 1980s, Germany prepared to become a question mark again. The wall would fall in 1989, but the arithmetic behind it had been collapsing for years. The external Cold War turned internal, and categories dissolved. Files were opened. East Germans read their own reports and the reports of their neighbors. The mathematics of betrayal became intimate. West Germans watched and wondered what would be demanded of them. Karl wondered if silence would be taxed. He read in the paper that a Soviet woman from Smolensk had returned for a reunion of victors and visited her old clinic. He imagined being there and thanking her for a sulfur pill that had saved a child in 1945. He imagined then returning to his kitchen and saying nothing. The story of civil life after 1945 was not a straight line. It was a score written for bricks and breath and bureaucracy. It featured curfews and curators of memory. It featured markets that sold carrots and official narratives that sold absolution. It featured denazification files that ended with signatures and lives that continued without them. It featured the expellee who learned to be from nowhere, and the child who learned to be from a war she had not seen. It featured a Soviet nurse who taught herself to live after learning how to watch men die. On November 9, 1989, the same date as the pogrom of 1938, the Berlin Wall opened, not by plan, but by a sentence misread at a press conference. The mathematics of misunderstanding created geography. Crowds surged, people hugged strangers, history obliged. Karl did not run to the war. He watched on a television that had belonged to a neighbor before a swap. He cried a little into his hand and then wiped it on his pants. He went to the same drawer where his first wartime notebook lay, brown and dented, with the dangerous sentence inside. He added a page. He wrote, "We did not starve. We built. We lied less than we might have and more than we should." He closed it. In 1991, the USSR dissolved. The Soviet nurse watched from a city with a wolf on its coat of arms and cried into a tea glass. She had been told many stories about her life. None of them matched the one she had in her head. Her Berlin notebook fell apart and she recopied parts of it onto lined paper with blue ink. She wrote lines that are not neat, but are familiar to anyone who has worked in human salvage. "We did what we could. We did what we had to." They asked us later, "Did you hate the Germans?" We said, "We were tired." In a municipal archive in Berlin, a box sits labeled Ration Office, 1945 to 1950. In it are ledgers in Karl's hand. The handwriting is disciplined and traditional. Calorie allocations have become statistics rather than emergencies. One can trace the curve of hunger down and the curve of prosperity up. The lines intersect in 1948 with the currency reform and in 1949 with state formation, in 1953 with uprising and fear, in 1961 with brick and barbed wire. The mathematics of life does not work like a graph, but the graphs reassure the trained eye. They tell a story of movement. They do not tell one of conscience. A student in 2005 writing a thesis in history ordered those files and was startled to find tucked in the back a list of names from May 1946. Names of children referred to as leicht untergewichtig, slightly underweight, in careful, almost tender script. Next to one name, a small cross. Next to two others, nothing. The student wrote in his conclusion, "The documents are very quiet. The documents have to be. They are designed to survive raids and floods and politicians. They are designed to be read without voices shaking." Oral histories, on the other hand, tremble. The human voice cracks on the sentence, "We didn't know." The human voice cracks on, "We knew." But we didn't want to be the sort of people who knew. What was the arithmetic of guilt? It was a ledger kept in millions of heads and revised at family tables. It was summarized in Spruchkammer outcomes and in the fragile piece of paper called the Purselschein. It was reduced by some to a technical detail and enlarged by others into a religion. It told policemen and party functionaries that they could sleep. It told survivors that sleep would be a negotiation. It told Karl that he was a little guilty and that he was a little useful, and that both would be required for him to live a life that did not tip over. It told the Soviet nurse that justice is a word that looks